Okay, so now that our player has the ability to jump up in the air, we want to make sure that he can't just keep jumping forever and ever. We want to make sure that our player can only jump when he's on the ground down here. And the way we're going to do that is by adding just a kind of a point at the player's feet to just check and see if the player is on the ground, basically. And the way we're going to do that is we have to know what is the actual ground going to be. And one of the built-in things within Unity is we can assign different objects to be parts of different what are called layers. So we've got all our ground and our platform things here. So what we're going to do is give them a layer that will be called ground. So if we go over to our layer thing in our layer drop down in our inspector here, we can see there's a few kind of default things already added in, but they're not what we want. So we want to go to add a new layer here. And just in the first box, the first empty box, the first few built-in ones like this are kind of not available to be messed around with. So the first empty slot here, we'll just type in ground like that. And then we're going to go back to our platform here. And what we want to do, actually no, we should make these changes to the prefabs that we've already set up before. So in our prefabs in here, what we're going to do now is on each one, we're just going to go to the layer and make sure it's set to ground. We can make it change the children, that's fine. We can actually just, so we've set that one there, we can actually select here all the rest of them and just go to layer, ground, we'll change the children and we'll see that they're all set to ground. So now we know that all of these objects are set to be the ground, so that if we have a point that we're using to check if something is the ground below us, we know that we're interacting with something on the ground. And while we're here, we might as well set the player's layer to also be a player. Just so in the future we might want to be able to use the layer stuff to affect changes on our player itself. So we want to make sure that we have that as a separate entity. So we'll go to here and we'll set player. So that's perfect. So now we need to actually check how we're finding the ground. And the way we're going to need to do that is by making some additions to our script. So we'll go into our scripts folder and we'll open up our player controller. And once that's open in Unity, or in MonoDevelop, sorry, we can see what stuff we're going to need to add. So, like I said, we're obviously going to need a certain point in space that we're going to want to use to check where the ground is. So, if we just add a couple of lines down here, what we're going to do is say public transform, and we're going to call it ground check. So what a transform is basically just any object in the world that has a position. So if we go back into our Unity and we look on our player or any other object, as I've discussed in an earlier episode, the transform here is on every single object. Any object we put into the world automatically has a transform, so that it can have a position in the world, a rotation and a scale. So basically what we're saying is we're going to have a point in space that we're going to use as the center of where we're checking where the ground is. So we go back to our script here. We want to make sure we put our semicolon at the end. So if we have a point like that, actually this should be a capital T. That's why we got it turned red there, because there was an error in it. So if we're going to use a point in space to check where the ground is, we needed to know how far outside of this point can I go to check whether there's ground below me, because we don't want it to see if there's ground 20 meters below. So what we're going to do is basically draw a little circle around this point, and we're just going to check if there's some ground within that circle. Basically we know that we're on the ground. So we need to know how big that circle will be, so we need to set a certain amount of radius. So for that we're going to say public float ground check radius, and that'll be the size that we're going to use. And the third thing that we're going to need to check this stuff is, because we just set up that all the ground pieces and the platforms will have a layer of ground set, we need to be able to check what layer is set for any object that we're touching, because if we're jumping onto the head of, say, an enemy or anything like that, obviously that won't have set to ground, and we don't want the player to be able to just jump off the top of an enemy or something like that. So we want to say, and not necessarily an enemy, even like a spike trap or any other kind of trap that we set up in the game. So we want to say public, and this time we'll say layer mask, and we'll show you what a layer mask is now in a second, and we'll just call this what is ground. Okay, so I'm going to save this and we're going to pop back into Unity here. So we've added 3 little things to our script. Once it compiles in the corner down there, once it finishes spinning basically, we'll scroll down to here, and now we've got a ground check, which is going to be a point in space. We've got a ground check radius, and we've got what is ground, which is our layer mask. And the layer mask is basically just checking what layer is it that we're going to use, and it creates this little drop down, and we have all the layers that we've created. So we can see if we scroll up here, they're the same as the ones we have available here. So we'll scroll back down, and we know we want to check for anything that's in the layer ground, so we want to leave that there. But just as an example, say in the future we wanted to check, we did want the ability to jump off an enemy's head, for example, we could just add another thing just by clicking on it like that, and what it does is it says that both of those things will be considered ground. So you can have multiple things clicked like that, and you can unclick them as you want to, and you end up with whatever combination of those things you want to actually use. So we're going to need to create this point in space that we're going to use on our player. So I'm just going to switch back to the scene view here. We're going to zoom in on the player by scrolling our wheel up, and what we're going to do is right click on the player here, and we're going to create an empty object, and what that'll do is it'll create the object as a child of the player here. So it's by default it's attached to the player. We're going to go to our movement stuff here, and we're going to drag this so it's just straight down, and we want to line it up basically with the bottom of the player's feet. It doesn't need to be 100% exact, because like I said, we're going to have a little circle drawn around this point that is going to represent where we're checking what ground we have. So now that we've added that, we're going to rename it here, and we're going to call it ground check. And then on our player, we'll scroll back down to our slot on our script here, and we're going to drag that into place in there. So now we know we're talking about that ground check, and we'll need to set a ground check radius value here, and you can mess around with this and see what suits for yourself, but the value that I'm going to be using here is 0.25. So that should just create just a circle kind of around this whole bottom area at the bottom of this collider here. Because if we look, our box collider's width is 0.5, so if we set our radius to be 0.25, that'll be the whole exact width of this box that our player is standing in. Okay, so we go back into our script here. So now we have the things that will let us check whether we're grounded, but we need something that our script can know at any particular time whether we're grounded or not, because we don't want to be checking every single time that we do something. We don't want to be checking the same thing over and over again. Say if we wanted to do jump here, this checks if we're on the ground, but we want to be able to do something else that relies checking if we're on the ground. We don't want to have to check every single time. What we want to do is check once and then put that into a value. And so what we're going to use for that is a thing called a bool. So we'll say public bool, and we'll call this is grounded. And what a bool is basically just a true or false statement. So if I save this here, we go back into Unity, what it shows up as on our player script, once it compiles again, we'll see down here, we'll see that it just appears basically as a checkbox. So it can either be true or false, and that's it. So now what we're going to do is check at which point our grounded should be true. So we'll just say is grounded here, which is our bool, and we want that to be either true or false. So how do we decide whether that is true? Well, we're going to use a thing called an overlap circle, which is basically going to draw a circle not physically on the screen that we can see, but just in the imaginary world of the computer. It's going to draw this circle around, and it'll tell us whether we're grounded or not. So we just type in here physics 2D with a capital D, and then physics 2D dot overlap circle. Okay, and then an opening bracket here. So if we look at the little kind of tooltip helper that opens up here, our overlap circle, we can see we have 1 of 4 here. So there's a few different options of things we can do with this. So by default, it can look, we'll need a point in space and we need a radius. But if we press down to the version we're going to use, we need a point in space, a radius, and we need a layer mask. So that's why we use the layer mask up here to determine what is the ground that we're looking for. Because, for example, the very first one here would use a point in space and a radius, and it would just check if there's anything within that circle that it creates. Whereas if we're looking for a specific layer mask, it will just check for anything only in that layer. So if we're looking for, at first we're looking for a point in space, so we know that the point we want to use is our ground check transform. So we will say our ground check like that. But as we discussed, a ground check or any transform in general has a position, a rotation, and a scale. But we don't want rotation or scale, so we specifically want position. So it's ground check dot position. Next we need a radius, and we've set up our radius, so that's our ground check radius. And then finally we have our layer mask, which is our what is ground up here. So what is ground? So now we have all the necessary components to do this little check. So basically what this little thing does is it creates the overlap circle around the point that we have to the given size and checks if it's the right layer within it, and if all of that is correct, then it will set is grounded here to be true, and if all of it is wrong, then it'll set is grounded to be false. So now we know at the start of every update loop of the game, it's checking to make sure whether the player is on the ground or in the air. And so now that we know whether the player is on the ground or not, we can add an extra little thing to our input get button down here. And basically we're just saying if our input is currently the jump button being pressed, and we want to add 2 ampersands like that, and what that means is and. It's the way of writing and basically within C#. So what we're saying is if our input jump button is being pressed and is grounded here, which is the value we've set, if is grounded. So what we could say here is grounded is equal to true. If I spelled that right. If is grounded is equal to true, but we can get rid of that bit because our is grounded is only a bool value, or a boolean value as it's called. So it can only be either true or false. So we know that we can just check whether that thing is true or false. So if it is true and we're getting a jump press down, then we can do our jump and action down here. Whereas if it's false and we press a jump button, then it won't run this thing. So that's why we say and here, because if it means that both of those things have to be true to run through this stuff. We could, for example, this isn't what we want to do at all. If we put 2 little vertical bars like that, that means or. So it would make the player jump if we were pressing the jump button or if we were just on the ground. So that wouldn't be very good. We just have our player bouncing around the whole place all over repeatedly, and it just wouldn't be good. So we'll put our ampersands back in, and we'll save this now, and we'll go back in here, wait for it to compile once more, and we should be able to play the game, and we should be able to jump up into the air just the way we want to. So we hit play, and now there we go. We can jump just the way we wanted to, but we can't. Oh, I fell down the side there. We can't jump away up into the sky. I can only jump, no matter how many times I press this button, we're only jumping once, and that's just what we want to happen. So now we know that our player can stay on the ground, but he still kind of looks like he's not very excited with what he's doing, so we need to add some animation.